Greetings and welcome to this inaugural dialogue of the Institute of Foreign Affairs in partnership with the University of Johannesburg Center for Africa-China Studies. My name is Paul Tsedu and I'll be the moderator for today's proceedings. Our today's theme is South African foreign policy amid COVID-19, national and continental priorities. The IFA is a newly founded research and advocacy institution aiming to contribute to the recalibration of foreign policy, diplomacy, and international political economy. It was one of the rationale for the establishment of the IFA that the institution should be able to introduce innovative methods of academic engagements with foreign policy, while in the process supporting established conventional systems of enhancing knowledge generation. Now, this is a strategy firmly embedded in the role of non-state actors in diplomacy. As President Nelson Mandela said that South Africa's foreign policy will be based on democracy and respect for human rights, and lately strengthening regional integration and, of course, the African agenda. Another goal of South Africa's foreign policy is disarmament, non-proliferation, and arms control. Now, our vision is to see ordinary people understanding and contributing to the fields of foreign policy. Ordinary people should directly inform and influence foreign policy. South Africa's international interests are our interests, all of us. These fields of diplomacy, foreign policy, and international relations in general are not beyond the comprehension of non-scholars. Therefore, the myth around these concepts being a reservation of a few elite must be revealed and challenged. And therefore, we thank the SABC and in particular the Foreign Desk for ensuring that knowledge sharing about foreign policy is broadcast to a wide spectrum audience. Now, as Africa Month draws to an end, the IFA and the University of Johannesburg chose the topic of silencing the guns in Africa. Given, of course, the instability and the absence of peace in various parts of Africa, through the multilateral bodies such as the UN Security Council and the African Union, South Africa plays a critical role in the organization of peace efforts in Africa. It is therefore our honor to have the Minister in the Department of International Relations and Cooperation, Dr. Pandor, joining us. And thank you very much, Minister. We look forward to developing a working relationship with you and the department. And we also take the opportunity to thank the University of Johannesburg, in particular the Center for Africa-China Studies. As we reimagine the future, we do so in the company of dedicated scholars who aim to shape a better world to live in. And I also take the opportunity to thank all those who have supported us in putting this together, the African think tanks who have been talking to us, the academics and scholars who advised us, and of course my family. And may I add a special appreciation, of course, to His Grace, the Right Reverend Bishop Dr. Barnabas Khanyan, for his continued spiritual counsel as we enter into this space of intelligentsia. Now, today's program is as follows. Firstly, the next speaker will share with us his thoughts under the theme Beyond Traditional Notions of African Security, 4IR, that is the Fourth Industrial Revolution Solutions to COVID-19 and Future Pandemics. Then he will introduce our guest speaker. I will then invite our esteemed panelist, Dr. Stembile Mbete, and of course our very own SABC foreign editor, Mesofi Mukwena. And we welcome your views and questions through the various platforms whose details will be scrolling on your screen. At the end, of course, the director of the Center of Africa-China Studies, Dr. David Munyai, will close the session. Now, he was born in a village called Dutuni in Venda, Kalabulgeg. After matriculating from Birui High, he obtained his mechanical engineering degree at the Case Western University in the United States and his master's in mechanical engineering at the University of Pretoria. And he then completed his PhD in engineering from the University of Cambridge. And he was a visiting fellow and professor at Harvard, Wolfson College, University of California, Nanjing University in China. And among many of his accomplishments, he is also a recipient of the Order of Mapungubwe in 2004. He's passionate about the artificial intelligence and is a publishing author. I hereby invite the Deputy Chair of the Presidential Commission on the Fourth Industrial Revolution, Vice Chancellor and Principal of the University of Johannesburg, Professor Chirizi Marwala, to address us.
Thank you very much, Paul, and all the listeners. I would like to first acknowledge the presence of our Honorable Minister, Dr. Naledi Pandor, and other panelists that I'm going to introduce a little bit later. At the start of the year, few would have recognized what deep shifts we would have to undertake as a globe. we could not have anticipated the devastating impact the coronavirus would have had on our economy and on our global relationships. It has completely subverted our national and continental priorities and will dictate our foreign policy for years to come. Thomas Jefferson once defined foreign policy as, and I quote, peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none, close quote. Yet, as the COVID-19 pandemic redefines almost every aspect of society, do we redefine foreign policy? In a recent article alongside my colleague, Baso Nzenze, we argued that in the wake of the COVID-19, the state has reasserted itself and most countries have cordoned themselves behind their borders. Will this continue to be the norm? How do we reframe our international relations in this context? It is difficult to figure out when the world will return to a semblance of normalcy and exactly what will that entail. Will we continue to look at foreign policy through the lens of COVID-19, or will a vaccine make this all a distant memory? No one quite knows what the post-corona world really entails, yet there will be no doubt be some irreversible changes in diplomacy, trade, and security thinking. Organized by the Institute of Foreign Affairs and the University of Johannesburg Center for Africa-China Studies, in collaboration with UJ Library, today's keynote address is going to be delivered by our Honorable Minister, Dr. Pandor, who will delve into South Africa's foreign policy amid COVID-19, looking at both our national and continental priorities. The minister is uniquely poised to provide insight into the, not only because of her current position as Minister of International Relations and Cooperation, she has also been a member of Parliament ever since 1994 and has served as Minister of Education, Minister of Science and Technology, Minister of Home Affairs. All these experiences are necessary if we are going to construct a post-corona world that is going to be in our favor, not against us. As the minister said in a dialogue with the United Nations and the African Union earlier this month, and I quote, "The socio-economic and humanitarian impact of COVID-19 threatens the gains we have achieved as the continent. Moreover, the impact is likely to be felt months, if not years, after the pandemic, even as we implement social and economic measures to mitigate the epidemiological risks," close quote. Yet, as the minister rightly pointed out, while the COVID-19 must be responded to effectively, our other challenges undoubtedly continue both nationally and across the continent. Our foreign policies must, of course, speak to all this. We are also joined by Dr. Sithembile Mbete, a senior lecturer in international relations at the University of Pretoria. We are also going to be joined by Ms. Sophie Mkwena, the foreign editor at the SABC, who has extensively covered South Africa's foreign policy for many, many years. We will also be joined by Dr. Munyai, the director of the Center for Africa and China Studies, who is an international relations and policy expert. Before I call upon Minister Pandor, I leave you with the words of John F. Kennedy, who once said, and I quote, "The purpose of foreign policy is not to provide an outlet for our own sentiments of woe or indignation. It is to shape real events in a real world," close quote. I thank you. Ndiyaribuwa enkosi ngiyabonga.
Ralebua, Professor Marala, thank you very much for that kind introduction. Let me begin by thanking the CEO of the Institute of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Mpotsedu, for inviting me to be part of this very intriguing seminar. Much of our work these days is conducted by virtual communication, even in the international space. And I'm able to confirm through a range of interactions that international relations is alive and that the international community is in constant engagement on the issues confronting our world today. I'll be speaking on the theme, Silencing the Guns in Africa, and reflecting on the role South Africa is playing in advancing peace and security on the continent and responding to humanitarian needs in the continent of Africa, but widely, globally as well. We have been searching for a successful conclusion to conflicts on the continent for several decades. We recall in 1990, the Organization of African Unity adopted the Declaration on the Political and Socioeconomic Situation in Africa and noted the fundamental changes taking place at the end of the 80s as it considered matters at its 26th session in July 1990. This declaration it adopted underscored Africa's resolve to determine its destiny, beginning, they said, with addressing the challenges to peace, democracy, and security, aspects that had deprived the people of Africa of their right to development and prosperity for many years. At its 50th anniversary in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, on the 25th of May, Africa Day, in 2013, African leaders once more revisited this issue of peace and security and recommitted themselves to the vision of a continent free of conflict and wars. They spoke and affirmed their determination that Africa must be free of conflict, that it could only be through peace that we would achieve development. They all agreed on the need to address the root causes of conflicts, including economic and social disparities, and determined in their statement that they would put an end to impunity by strengthening institutions that would foster accountability. They referred to the imperative to eradicate recurrent and emerging sources of conflict. These included piracy, trafficking in humans and in narcotics, ending all forms of extremism, armed rebellion, fighting terrorism, transnational organized crime, and new crimes such as cybercrime. They agreed on the urgency to push forward the agenda of conflict prevention, peacemaking, peace support, post-conflict reconstruction and development. In order to give teeth to these 2013 Addis Ababa commitments, the Peace and Security Council of the African Union developed an AU master roadmap of practical steps to silence the guns in Africa by the year 2020. This was 3 years after the 2013 declaration in Addis. So this 2016 roadmap was the AU-endorsed roadmap which would direct all efforts to implement this desire for peace on the continent. A number of initiatives have accompanied this determination. These include the launch in 2017 of the Africa Amnesty Month in September, an event which is held each year on the continent. This is an initiative which affords African citizens who hold arms an opportunity to voluntarily surrender their illegal weapons to designated state authorities without any repercussion and also a commitment to working with the United Nations through adopting UN Security Resolution 2457, which recognized African efforts to strengthen peace support operations on the continent and the commitment of the UN to work with Africa to achieve peace and security. We as South Africa, on becoming chair of the African Union, appropriated the notion of silencing the guns in Africa by 2020 and creating conducive conditions for Africa's development as our theme of our chairship of the AU. We recognized through designating this theme that conflict and stability remain serious challenges across the continent of Africa and continue to adversely affect development. They perpetuate poverty, they reduce the incentive for foreign investment, and conflict certainly hinders our achievement of the objectives of Agenda 2063, the Africa we want. We have a number of areas on the continent in which we continue to have very serious evidence of conflict. This includes the Sahel region of Africa, the Lake Chad Basin, conflicts in the Central African region, the warring conflicts in Eastern Congo, conflicts in the Horn of Africa, conflict in Sudan, South Sudan, and most worryingly, the conflict in Libya. These flashpoints hamstring the ability of the African Union to achieve its aim of preventing conflict, of resolving disputes, and advancing socioeconomic development. We decided that 2020 would be the year in which we would heighten the implementation of the AU Master Roadmap to address the root causes of conflict and to ensure we reduce tensions and focus on Agenda 2063. The outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic has affected our ability to focus on our theme and has forced us to redirect our attention to implementing actions directed at defeating this deadly menace. As the African Union, we remain committed to implementing the Master Roadmap, and we will continue to focus on those actions that we had agreed would be part of the steps toward addressing the need for peace and security in Africa. We continued, for example, to build on some of the promising developments that we have had on the African continent, continue even as we confront the critical challenge of COVID-19. The AU Commission has reported that we are seeing greater collaboration among member states, civil society, the United Nations, various international organizations, and non-governmental organizations, all working together to address matters of reconciliation and conflict resolution in countries confronted by insecurity. We have reports of success stories of former combatants disarming and of terrorist groups being demobilized in different parts of the continent. And we now have the African Union and countries in Africa playing a far greater role in peacekeeping on the continent. We have African Union troops deployed in Somalia, in Central African Republic, in Darfur, and in the Lake Chad Basin. We also have our troops working hard in the Democratic Republic of Congo to maintain peace and security. Another important development has been the key role that women as leaders on conflict resolution have begun to play on the continent. So we have made some progress in reducing violent and armed conflicts in different parts of Africa. All are aware of the recently concluded peace agreement in South Sudan and the ongoing peace efforts in Central African Republic. We also know of the successful democratic elections in Madagascar, as well as the elections in the DRC last year, as well as historic positive developments in the Horn of Africa. All these generate optimism that the continent may be beginning a steady move from the shadows and beginning to restore the kind of peace and stability that will assist us to make promise real on development. South Africa has played a very important role in pursuing peace in Africa. We have participated in a number of peacekeeping and peace enforcement missions. And we've played this role since the inception of our democracy in 1994. So far, our country has participated in peacekeeping missions of the United Nations and of the African Union in Sudan, in the Darfur region, under the UN and AU hybrid mission, UNAMID, in the DRC as part of MONUSCO, and in Burundi as part of the UN force deployed in that country. We have committed 1,153 troops and police members to 3 UN-mandated peace missions on our continent. As South Africa, we are the 17th largest troop contributing country to the United Nations. And so we're playing a very significant role in the advance of peace and security. We've also played a key mediation role by helping parties in conflict in countries such as South Sudan and Lesotho to find peace. Our president, through his envoys, has played a particularly important role in ensuring that we achieve peace in Lesotho and through Deputy President Mabuza in South Sudan. We are very, very encouraged by the positive developments that occurred in South Sudan at the beginning of this year, when a unity government was finally formed. This has paved the way for what we hope will be the full implementation of the revitalized peace agreement. The silencing of the guns in South Sudan will, we hope, lead to lasting peace in that country and allow it to address challenges relating to refugees, displaced persons, food insecurity, and the absence of a full culture of human rights and justice. We also attach great importance to ensuring a gender dimension to the promotion of peace and security on the African continent. We are fully supportive of Resolution 1325 of the UN Security Council, adopted in the year 2000, on women, peace, and security. And it is for this reason that we have played a great role in ensuring a gender perspective in our peace and security efforts. We continue to train women from all over the African continent on conflict resolution and on ensuring they play a full role in supporting post-conflict reconstruction. We also strive to protect women from violence in areas where conflict subsists. We've also played an important role in responding to humanitarian disaster. Humanitarian diplomacy is part of South Africa's foreign policy. We implement this through our African Renaissance and International Cooperation Fund. which provides humanitarian assistance to various countries in the African continent. This reflects one of our strategic goals, which is that of creating a better South Africa and contributing to a better and safer Africa in a better world. Our diplomacy is primarily in the humanitarian sector, focused on the African continent, although there are countries beyond our continent that we do offer humanitarian support to. We provide support whenever disaster might strike countries on our continent. This responds to how we were supported as South Africa when we were fighting our own liberation struggle, when different African countries came to our aid, and many in the global community supported our struggle. We have in the last year supported humanitarian needs in countries afflicted both by conflicts as well as natural disasters. We've provided assistance to Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Malawi, and have even assisted in Syria and Venezuela. Earlier this year, we pledged to provide support for humanitarian assistance in the Sahel region, given the massive impact of terrorist activity and armed conflict in that part of the world. We work very closely with international organizations such as the World Food Programme, the United Nations Office for Coordinating Humanitarian Affairs, the United Nations Commission on Refugees, the Human Rights Commission, and of course, the International Committee of the Red Cross. Our contribution is of course modest in comparison to major donors of the world, but we do strive to ensure that we don't neglect the needs of others in the world. We believe if we are all to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, we must ensure that no one is left behind and that we should play our international role by reducing risk and harm for communities that are suffering major disasters. We also provide support through our investment in research to respond to the current crisis of COVID-19. One of the most important features of countries' responses to the impact of COVID-19 has been the degree to which international collaboration and thus multilateralism has assumed importance. We have all agreed in the international domain that there is no one country that will find a solution to the COVID-19 virus, that all of us as countries in the global community will have to cooperate, contribute, and work through our research institutions to ensure that the innovation we're all seeking, the treatment we are all desperately in need of, will be discovered jointly and will be shared equitably across the world. It is for this reason that President Ramaphosa has indicated South Africa's participation in the global search for a vaccine against the coronavirus. We believe to defeat this pandemic, we must ensure that multilateral cooperation drives all our activities. This disaster has pointed out that multilateralism is more necessary than ever before to avert a global disaster. Some have expressed concern that contemporary multilateralism is too weak to tackle the global pandemic. But we believe that the efforts the world has undertaken in collaboration indicate that in fact we cannot do without multilateralism. We are also pleased that we are supporting African capacity in research and innovation through Africa's investment in the Africa Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and through ensuring that we attend to the matters that relate to the post-COVID recovery process. We have appointed, through the chairperson of the African Union, special envoys to ensure that we seek funding to provide support to African countries to invest in the post-COVID-19 economic recovery process. We have called, as have many developing countries, for debt deferral for a minimum of 2 years to ensure that Africa has the liquidity and resources to invest in its health systems and in supporting our economies on post-COVID-19 recovery. So as South Africa, we will continue to seek partnerships and collaboration with a range of partners throughout the global community to ensure that we do defeat this pandemic. We will also use our humanitarian resources to continue assisting countries on the continent that might not be able to find the resources that are necessary to grapple with this pandemic. We must thank all the countries that have provided assistance to our own countries up to this point, and those that have committed to supporting the African continent to respond to the health emergency all of us are confronted by. And we thank the Institute for hosting seminars of this nature so that the world might become more aware of what is being done both by South Africa and the global community to address this most challenging of health situations that is confronted by the world. I thank you, moderator.
Thank you very much, Minister, for those insightful words. Indeed, a message that managed to capture a lot of activities which South Africa is involved in. Of course, having touched indeed on a very critical part that these conflicts in Africa are costly economically and financially, and we appreciate the role that South Africa is playing. And we indeed thank you very, very much, Minister, for that message. Unfortunately, we are virtual. I can't even ask for a round of applause, but I guess my colleagues are applauding wherever they are. The next speaker, she shares a particular subject with me in common, which is South Africa's role within the United Nations Security Council. In fact, she has done quite a lot of work, including her PhD, having been focused on that particular aspect of South Africa's membership within the Security Council of the UN. Let me call upon Dr. Stembile Mbete, who is a lecturer at the University of Pretoria in the Political Sciences Department, with a special focus on international relations, to give us her take on what the minister has said and what she has established around the topic of silencing the guns. Dr. Mbete.
Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. Thank you to the Center for inviting me as a respondent to Minister Pandor's address. Thank you very much, Minister, for your address and for taking us through some aspects of South African foreign policy, particularly in this time of dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. I was asked specifically to look and to respond to the topic of assessing the silencing of the guns across the continent and the globe, the institutional drivers and hindrances. Much of what I want to say and want to draw on has been raised already by the minister. So I'll be referencing a great deal what the minister has said, but then also raising a few questions about some of the institutional barriers to silencing the guns in Africa in 2020 and in achieving that goal. The AU's theme for 2020 is silencing the guns, creating conducive conditions for Africa's development. And this theme points to two things. It links the agenda and the purpose of maintaining international peace and security and silencing the guns to economic development. And it's based on a recognition that economic development is impossible in a context of ongoing armed conflict on the continent. That ending violent conflict is a necessary condition to be able to create an environment for economic growth, for job creation, for major infrastructure development throughout the continent, and to be able to create a stable, prosperous future for the youth of Africa. Of the 1.3 billion people in Africa, 60% of them are below the age of 25. The median age of the continent is 19.7. So the median age of the median African is 20 years old, if you round it up. And we will not be able to create a prosperous future for that person in a continent still plagued by conflict and insecurity. And this is a point that Minister Pandor made in her address. Part of the initiatives also that the African Union has been driving in order to ensure a prosperous future for the youth of the continent in future is the signing of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement in 2019, which looks set to open up a market of 50 trillion rand of trade and investment throughout the continent. Of all regions in the world, Africa trades the least with each other. In Europe, in Asia, in Latin America, in North America, the immediate region is the major trading partner of most countries. In Africa, Africans trade the least with each other. And so this African Continental Free Trade Agreement really creates an opportunity for us to develop markets and to develop economically. But this is not possible in a context of continued conflict. And as the minister said, we have seen ongoing conflict throughout the continent, intractable conflicts in a number of areas. We've seen in the Sahel region, and particularly in recent times, burgeoning of conflict in Burkina Faso, which was an area that had been peace for quite some time. We've seen in Libya, even during this crisis, serious conflict spurring up in Libya, in the Horn, and of course in our own neighbor, Mozambique. We've seen a surge of terrorist activity in northern Mozambique, particularly in the Cabo Delgado province, which poses a security threat, not just to South Africa as the chair of the AU, but also poses a serious threat to our national security because Mozambique is a neighbor on our borders, and this is something for us to think of quite seriously. And so within this context, South Africa's role as the chairperson, President Ramaphosa as the chairperson of the AU, but also our role as the chair of the APRM group of countries is really important for helping us to drive some of the initiatives around silencing the guns, but also around bringing economic development. Of course, as the minister has said, a lot of that focus has been derailed into focusing on dealing with the immediate health pandemic and the immediate health crisis of COVID-19. But I think that as the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, Amina Mohammed, in a recent op-ed stated that the COVID-19 crisis has really brought into sharp relief existing development issues and conflicts and fault lines within countries. So whether that is the importance of infrastructure so that people can have the water that they need to wash their hands throughout the continent, whether that is the importance of the informal sector as the main employer and economic activity of most Africans, or whether that is the challenges around the safety of women. We've seen a rise of gender-based violence across the continent. What we've also seen is the difficulty of humanitarian efforts. Minister Pandor spoke to a great length about South Africa's involvement in humanitarian activities throughout the continent. And one of the problems of the measures that have been brought to deal with the COVID-19 crisis is that it's made it exceptionally difficult for humanitarian aid to get to some of the people that need it. And this has raised all sorts of questions then about some of the needs of the continent. And so what South Africa has done in its capacity as the AU chair has been mostly focusing on debt and the debt standstill. President Ramaphosa earlier this week was involved in a call, in a high-level event on framing development in the eve of, in response to COVID-19 and beyond, a meeting that was organized by the Canadian Prime Minister and also hosted with the UN. And in that meeting, he reiterated South Africa's call and support of the call of the African Union for a debt standstill for 2 years for developing countries, particularly in Africa. He supported the allocation of more IMF drawing rights to help central banks and companies to deal with the shocks of the pandemic. And he supported the call of the Secretary General for the development of a comprehensive debt framework to ensure that no country is left behind in the economic development post the crisis. But of course, so much of the president's efforts have been around this issue of debt. And in some ways, it has raised questions about the focus on silencing the guns and on that mandate, because one of the unfortunate things about the response to the COVID-19 crisis throughout the continent with the lockdowns is that it's led to an extensive there's been an extensive militarization of some responses. And of course, because of the scarcity, of the economic scarcity, of food scarcity that has come with the lockdowns, it's created a lot more new avenues for conflict over resources within different communities across the continent. And so I think that it would be really worthwhile to have a greater focus from the South African government as part of our position in the AU on mitigating some of the renewed conflicts or some new conflicts that may emerge during this ongoing COVID crisis and in a post-COVID environment. Turning now to South Africa's position in the UN Security Council, we're serving our third term in the Security Council. We're about 6 months away from the termination of our term in December 2020. And South Africa has played an important role as a bridge builder in a very divided Security Council. The permanent 5 members of the Security Council have been increasingly divided on West-East divides, but we've also seen a great deal of division and inconsistency between the policies of the United States and the other 2 Western members of the permanent members of the Security Council, the United Kingdom and France. We are also seeing, as part of the COVID-19 crisis, increasing tensions between China and the United States. We all heard yesterday President Donald Trump say that that Hong Kong will lose all special concessions that it had from the United States in response to China's political activities in Hong Kong, and that Hong Kong is now going to be seen and treated as a part of China. And what this means is that it has undermined the ability of the UN Security Council to really operate to fulfill its mandate in the UN Charter as a guarantor of international peace and security. South Africa has tried to mitigate this crisis by organizing the elected 10 members of the Security Council to meet every month in Pretoria, and to facilitate cooperation among the elected 10 members in order to reach consensus in some UN Security Council decisions. But I certainly think that what the COVID-19 crisis has done is that it's only going to exacerbate the divisions that we are seeing within the UN Security Council. A classic case in point is that on the 23rd of March, I think it was already, the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres released a statement calling for a global ceasefire, calling on all armed combatants to cease their conflict in order to allow the requisite response to COVID-19 and for the world to fight the common enemy of COVID-19. But what we've seen in the Security Council is that the Security Council has not been able to reach consensus on a resolution to support the Secretary General in his call for a global ceasefire, or even a more watered down resolution that just makes a statement about dealing with the COVID-19 crisis. The last attempt at doing that, draft resolution by Tunisia, as co-sponsored by Tunisia and France, was not able to reach, the Security Council was not able to reach agreement on that issue. And so I think that South Africa's role as a bridge builder, as a country that can speak both to the interests of Africa and the global South, but also is also engaged in forums like the G20, and can engage as an equal in many ways to Western countries, is going to be very important in the next 6 months as the UN Security Council tries to reach some agreement on a unified position towards COVID-19. I think that this is also going to be exacerbated by the US's decision to withdraw from the World Health Organization, and within the UN system, South Africa has played a very important role in supporting Dr. Tedros, the Director General of the WHO, and continuing with that support. I just want to close now with 3 points and 3 areas I think that will be important for South Africa in relation to COVID-19, but also foreign policy as it develops in the future. I think firstly, as Minister Pandor has spoken about, the issue of women, peace and security, I think, remains and should remain at the top of South Africa's agenda around peace and security issues and the agenda of silencing the guns. What we've seen is that the COVID-19 crisis has brought the issues of human security right back onto the agenda again. That focusing on individuals and individuals' well-being has taken center stage again, and not just the well-being of states or the security of states. What we've also seen is that 70% of the workforce, of the essential workers that are helping countries deal with COVID-19, the nurses, the cleaners, the supermarket workers, the food market workers are women. And so if nothing else, this emphasizes that we cannot have women be excluded from the big conversations on security and development on the continent. The second thing is that I think that South Africa is going to need to, what the future view of South Africa should be, is about how do we mitigate and keep balance in this renewed superpower tension that we are seeing that is coming up in the globe currently. We know that with the last Cold War, with the US and the USSR, Africa bore the brunt. The war was cold between the US and the USSR, but it was very hot for the African continent. Many proxy wars were being fought here. And with the increase of military presence, foreign military presence on the continent, in Djibouti, for example, most of its COVID-19 cases have come from the fact that there are other countries' military bases there. So how is South Africa going to engage to ensure that the new superpower conflict does not result in new proxy conflicts on the continent. And then the final thing is that I think that South Africa really needs to lead the focus on youth. By 2050, Africa is going to have the majority of young people in the world already live in Africa, and by 2100, Africa's population will be 2 times that of Europe. So the future of the world is African. Africa is where the world's market is going to be in the future, and this is where all new innovation is going to be coming from. And I think that we need South Africa to be playing a far greater role in shaping the future, not only of South African youth, but also a world in which the youth of the continent can prosper. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you very much, Dr. Stambile Mbete there. Quite a thesis, I must say, and we're happy that we are engaging and are going to continue to engage with some of the issues that are being raised here. Let me, without any waste of time, call upon a former colleague, former political reporter, shall I say a political news junkie, so to say. Sophie Mukwena, she's the foreign editor at the SABC, and I invite her to also give us her input in as far as this topic is concerned, silence in the guns. What has the media seen? How can or rather, how will Sophie Mukwena present an observation from the media? Ms. Sophie.
Thank you, Paul. Let me start by saying, when we look at the history of South Africa in general, South Africa has been involved in many, many conflicts around the world. Let's start with the World War I. We know that our forefathers participated in that war. You go to a situation where the League of Nations was formed, but they were excluded. Africans were excluded during the formation of that League of Nations, but also to ensure that we don't prosper. We were not being involved in terms of drafting resolutions around the establishment of the League of Nations. Therefore, we were excluded on issues of peace and stability. The second issue is the formation of the United Nations. Yes, we were there during the Second World War, but when the United Nations was formed, again, Africa didn't really play an important role, or it was not considered. You look at what's happening within the Security Council currently. Earlier on, we heard that the Security Council, it's dominated by 5 countries. But when you look at the conflicts around the world, the continent that is experiencing lots and lots of conflict is African continent, but we are not having veto powers within the Security Council. And therefore, somebody is dictating to us how to bring peace, and you bring peace by silencing the guns. The second issue is that South Africa, post-1994, it took a clear, conscious decision in terms of the foreign policy that it will work towards uniting the world, but also to put issues of development at the forefront, because without development, there's no way you can achieve peace. And therefore, I think we have to start there. If we want to silence the guns on the continent, we must be inclusive. We shouldn't commit the mistake of the past where after the First World War, those who were around the table were not inclusive. Shouldn't commit the same mistake after the Second World War, those who paved way for the formation of the United Nations and the Security Council were not inclusive. So the key issue here is inclusivity. The African Union must be inclusive. We know that our founding fathers, I'm talking about Haile Selassie, I'm talking about Julius Nyerere, I'm talking about Kenneth Kaunda, and all those who ensured that we have the Organization of African Unity. The aim was one, to unite the continent. Again, inclusivity. And now the formation or the transformation of the Organization of African Unity to the AU, it was inclusive. We know it took a lot of time. I think the minister can confirm that to ensure that all countries on the continent were on board. I remember during the launch of the African Union in Durban, a day before, it was touch and go because people were thinking that some countries were not on board. But South Africa, again, demonstrated its skills in terms of diplomacy and inclusivity by ensuring that all countries were on board, except Morocco, of course. And now, what is critical is that for Africa to be able to silence the guns, Africa must continue in that path of being inclusive. And therefore, the chairperson of the African Union, currently President Cyril Ramaphosa, must continue to ensure that in whatever is being done on the continent, we work together. And he has demonstrated that. We will only be able to silence the guns if we also include the citizens of this continent so that they understand why it is important for the continent to silence the guns. But if they continue to be poor, to be hungry, and have challenges of diseases, they will not buy into this important project because for them, they will not see any value in maintenance of peace and stability, because when you silence the guns, the intention is to maintain peace and stability. Therefore, the development becomes a key issue here. We have to ensure that we silence poverty, and silencing of guns will come automatically. We must focus on development. Therefore, it is the role of the media on the continent to zoom into, are the leaders doing enough to silence poverty? And by extension, to silence the guns. We have to ask hard questions, look at the policies of our respective countries as media, whether they speak to that. We must also communicate to the African population issues that are important for the continent to prosper. We must also create a platform for ordinary citizens of this continent to express their views, but also to provide solutions. It shouldn't be leaders only providing solutions. Let the ordinary Africans decide in terms of the future development of this continent. I mean, we must really emphasize nothing about us without us. Let the citizens of this continent participate. Then, when you look at the COVID-19, it has actually made us realize that it is more urgent now to ensure that we really silence poverty and we also silence the guns. Because when you look at how countries are affected on the continent, you then realize that it is important for African countries to work together. But because of poverty, because of certain areas where you have instability, it's not easy to move around to go and assist in other areas. The lockdown, closing of borders have actually made this problem of challenges facing the continent to be even more deeper, because there is no movement of people, even though there is some movement of goods and services. but also it is in a very slow pace. And therefore, the humanitarian assistance or the medical assistance, it will take time to reach those areas where you have challenges. The minister has pointed out in terms of where the hotspots are. Those hotspots are there because the regional bodies in those respective areas are not doing enough to ensure that in that region where you have those countries that are experiencing conflict, there is peace and stability and the silencing of the guns. Therefore, the regional bodies as well must play an important role in silencing poverty and also silencing the guns. The external interference, it's something that we have to really look at. African countries must be independent. They are politically independent, but they are not economically independent because many still rely on donations and perhaps help from outside the continent. And therefore, those who are assisting us, at times they want to dictate to us what we have to do. And therefore, it is also important to ensure that the African Union speak in one voice to say, we have African problems, we must provide a solution. Can you hear me, Mpo?
Yes, I can hear you very well, Sophie Mkwena. Thank you very much for that.
Yes, I'm saying, finally, I just want to say,
yes,
the continent must realize that working together, we can be a better continent. And therefore, during this COVID-19, we must use this opportunity to ensure that member countries of the African Union work together on silencing poverty and also silencing the guns. Because what COVID-19 has done is to expose the inequalities that are there, that are glaring. And now when we see people being restless, for example, when you see what's happening in the United States of America, it's people who are restless and people who can't do anything, who can't survive. Here in South Africa, we might have similar problems if we don't stand up to ensure that we deal with issues of poverty and inequality. All member countries must do the same. Thank you, Mpo.
Thank you very much, Sophie Mkwena. There quite insightful observations there. Minister, I'm going to give you an opportunity right away to just respond to these submissions so that we get this dialogue going on. I'm sure you would like to clarify certain issues or points that have been raised by our panelists there. Minister.
Thank you very much, Mpo, for that opportunity. I think that both speakers, and I must congratulate you that we've had 3 women speakers. This is very clever of you to get the best, Mpo. But let me say that I believe that we have not forgotten that we must focus on silencing the guns. I assure all the participants that this continues to be a very important focus for our president and for the African Union. In fact, in the midst of responding to the pandemic, we have had already meetings with Libya, discussions with regions where there are conflicts. So we continue to strive to find solutions to those problems that really reverse quite significant gains that the continent had made. What I think we all are distressed by is the halt or pause that has been put to our plans with respect to the Africa Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. We really had a very smooth lead up to the period up to March, and then suddenly everything had to come to a standstill. We'd even successfully appointed the Secretary General, who is a South African, and had planned that the first tariff arrangements would be announced at the beginning of July, and that we'd begin to operationalize intra-trade in that month. We have agreed that we postpone the significant onboard and launch into the first part of 2021. But in the meantime, all the deliberations on the tariff regime and other measures necessary for successful piloting and implementation of the agreement are underway. The office is being set up. The various payment systems are being developed. Discussions are underway as to goods that would be part of the free trade regime. So we haven't stopped. This remains a critical intervention for the African continent. I fully agree with Dr. Mbete as to youth and the fact that they should become increasingly a focus for our continent and indeed for our country. I've been intrigued that some of the technology solutions that are responding to the pandemic, and particularly the data gathering processes, have been devised by young people on the African continent. So clearly they have a very critical role to play. Well, all of us are looking at what the global makeup of the superpowers will be. It's clear that a shift is underway. As to what the final outcome will be, all of us are, hoping that there will be clarity in the next few weeks. But I think it looks like it's going to be somewhat of a titanic battle. And we're hoping it doesn't harm too much of what the global community has achieved in the past decades of the existence of a multilateral system. We are concerned that a renewed and more intense trade war will definitely harm our efforts to overcome the economic effects of COVID-19. So I do think silent diplomacy at the multilateral level will be important. I think a gentle whisper in the ears of the most powerful men is going to become of great significance, because if they are not alert to the fact that the world has to deal with the aftermath together, they're going to harm any chance of sustainable recovery. Thank you very much as well to Sophie Mukwena for reminding us about the need to reform the UN Security Council. When we are in the midst of the hurly-burly of international affairs, we tend to neglect this important task of UNSC reform. The structure of the Security Council, its composition, the fact of temporary membership by elected members, the absence of a real powerful role for the African continent as a significant membership of the United Nations is a really unacceptable phenomenon. And so we have continued to argue that we want to get to the point of text-based negotiations on UNSC reform, because we see there's a lot of dilly-dallying and hesitation about whether there should be a real grip with this issue, which means this is where the site of power is. And hence, I think the AU and the African continent must not remove their attention from this important subject of ensuring we pursue reform of the Security Council and various mechanisms of the United Nations. I think we certainly must ensure that should there be, and it's all the scientists are saying there will be another pandemic of this nature, when it comes, our health systems must be stronger, our ability to support our populations should be far better, our systems and institutions of governance should be stronger. So Africa must not find its place as a space of disadvantage. And I think what this has very clearly put in front of the eyes of the leaders of the continent is the fact that we have to attack our weaknesses and ensure that we overcome them in order to place our continent in a better space. And so I absolutely agree with Sophie. Let's attend to economic independence. We are still relying on masks from elsewhere. We are relying on ventilators from elsewhere. Let us ensure that we become independent and become masters and mistresses of our own fate and not rely on anyone, because when there is a crisis, everybody looks to themselves. And so it is critical that the matter of our own economic strength and independence is fully addressed. Thank you very much, and I'll stop there.
Thank you very much for that response. Perhaps let me just take the opportunity before I call Dr. Mnyai to close to ask my question to you, Minister, as to what do you see as the role of non-state actors in the foreign policy of South Africa? I mean, we've seen in the past where non-state actors were playing quite a critical role in the pressurization of the South African government to accede to the demands for for freedom and the relaxation of all those draconian laws. But in this democratic dispensation, what can those your NGOs, your influential individuals, the likes of us, what becomes our role in this foreign policy of South Africa and diplomacy in general?
Paul, let me thank you again. You asked really difficult questions. You've always been like that with me. I don't know why. Let me just come back to this by citing the case of Palestine. I continue to be totally concerned about the plight of the people of Palestine, and that in the 21st century, so few of us are giving attention to how that community and those people are being treated, in particular by one country with the support of a very powerful partner. I think if there is a campaign we could wage, it would be to ensure freedom at last for the people of Palestine. And there are many such causes throughout the international community that require popular attention and popular campaigns, such as we had in the international struggle against apartheid. If we could marshal more of the world community to give attention to the fact that it's become very easy to seize the territory of the people of Palestine and for nothing to be said. And yet when South Africa speaks about restoring land ownership to African people, countries that support the actions of Israel on Palestine say nothing in support of African people in South Africa. So I think there are people in the world who are left marginalized, vulnerable, the people of Sahrawi, the people of Palestine, the internecine warfare in Yemen, what is happening in Libya, and particularly the trafficking of African migrants through Libya. So I believe civil society and institutions such as the one you lead have a very important role to play. And I hope that we will develop partnerships between DIRCO and institutes such as yours. And of course, university departments, so that we have engagements and we draw on the evidence that you have the time to gather as part of our armor as we practically implement the foreign policies of South Africa. I'm hoping, and we are working on this with my team, that we will develop a basis for us to have more regular interactions with colleagues in a range of institutions so that we begin to sharpen our own sword as we set about locating South Africa in the international community of nations. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Minister, for that response. And indeed, we stand ready to partner with the department and all the other stakeholders to really shape and sharpen this foreign policy to be consistent with the democratic principles that the foundation, which are the foundation of this beautiful land and country of ours. Dr. Munyai, let me invite you to close this session for us. Dr. Munyai is, of course, the Executive Director at the Center for Africa-China Studies, which is at the University of Johannesburg. And they are indeed in partnership with us as the Institute of Foreign Affairs. Dr. Munyai.
Thank you very much, Honorable Minister and fellow panelists. Let me take this opportunity to really thank you, Mr. Mpho Zeru, and the Institute for Foreign Affairs. We welcome you to this field of study and indeed to carry significant research on issues of international affairs and the role of South Africa, the continent, and the world. We indeed, as we have heard from the Honorable Minister and fellow speakers, that South Africa is playing a critical role, and we also live in a fast-changing world. We have heard of the tension that are taking place between the world's two biggest powers, which has a huge implication on our own foreign policy and on Africa's ability to achieve the vision of the Agenda 2063. So it is quite important, therefore, that institutions of higher learning are working with NGOs, working with other important centers of knowledge, including Parliament, that work quite closely to bring in ordinary people on matters which is often perceived as complex of foreign affairs or belonging to elite. I think this is quite important because what we consider as domestic matters, they have huge implication on international, and COVID virus has also given us quite huge lessons that what is happening in the United States, in UK and China have a great implication on our own shores. And therefore, I think we need to move with speed in dealing with unity. I think what is central is unity on the African continent, unity in bringing peace and security, silencing the gun, the ability to ensure Africans can develop with the assistance of others, and therefore bringing in all other strategic partners that we have all over the world. But what we have noticed in the last few years is that often we do not know what we want from others. I think there is a need for us to be very clear as we enter into a relationship, a strategic relationship with all partners in the world. We define, we play a leading role in terms of what we need from them instead of them dictating what we need. I think the third and fourth important issue, it's a question of us telling our own narratives, our ability to tell our own stories. As it stands, we really don't have a strong and formidable continental-wide news agency that can broadcast stories on Africa. I think we need really to have SABC is doing the best it can. SABC Africa that can compete with CNN, compete with CGTN, Al Jazeera, and others. I think it's high time that we tell these stories, and there's power in visuals. And therefore, I think with the initiatives such as this would really work with the minister and all other relevant players to ensure that African stories is told by Africans, and we lead in that. Let me take this opportunity to thank the Honorable Minister for giving us such a great insight on what is happening in our foreign affairs, as well as at the continental level, this critical year that we are in. She has touched on a number of issues, and I think our role is to ensure that we contribute with IFA involvement in research, in contributing relevant policy that could assist government, as well as at the continental level, the AU itself. Let me thank Professor Chilete Marwala, the Vice Chancellor at the University of Johannesburg in his absence, for the role that he has played, and the key speakers, Dr. Mbete and Me Mkwena, for wonderful inputs in today's deliberation. In conclusion, once again, I would like to thank our strategic partner, the Institute for Foreign Affairs. Would like to welcome you in this field, and the Center for Africa-China Studies is ready to work closely. And I cannot conclude without thanking a huge team that played a critical role for this event to take place at our own center at KEX, the strategic partner, the library, SABC, and members of the Institute for Foreign Affairs. I think with those words, once again, I'd like to thank you, Honorable Minister, and we see this as a start of future interactions that are relevant for ordinary people in the country and on the continent. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mnyai. And from me, indeed, have yourself a wonderful time. Maina Kiamararo.
And that's a wrap, of course, from the University of Johannesburg Center for Africa-China Studies in collaboration with the University of Johannesburg Library. There you saw the Minister of International Relations, Dr. Naledi Pandor, sitting there chatting about the importance of relations, in particular on the continent. We also saw our editor there, SABC News, foreign editor Sophie Mokoena, also part of that summit. We'll take a quick break. Stay with us. More news at the top of the hour.